Alright, welcome back to We Play Games. Here we are in our advanced country guide with Afghanistan, about to discuss the GDP rework and the slight rework in regards to ranks and subjects. The bulk of this, however, is going to be a conversation about the GDP rework. So prior to 1.2, the GDP of your nation was really easy to grow by just doing tools, steel, iron, and coal, and those heavy industries together, generally speaking, created sort of like an infinite GDP growth for you. But that wasn't real GDP, that was just Victoria 3 GDP. Now the way that GDP is calculated, it's much more in line with what real GDPs actually look like. And so now, in order to grow your GDP, you need to have control over end-of-line consumption. End-of-line consumption means you gotta have control over pops who are buying goods, or control over trade routes that are buying goods. And so what that means, broadly speaking, is that growing your GDP is no longer just sort of like a consequence of building an economy. It's a specific kind of economy that's going to be growing its GDP the most. And so I think that you need to first understand that this means that GDP is no longer as critical an underwriting number as it once was. It's still going to be really good and it's still very important, but because it's one of these metrics that is so specifically controllable via stuff like import-export routes that don't necessarily add value to your economy, that you do need to take this with a grain of salt. But what it does mean in terms of the macro implications are really big. First, it means that you still probably want to be chasing productivity. Productivity is going to be injecting the most money into your economy, especially if you're turning peasants or unemployed into gainfully employed pops. Building stuff that's high productivity is just going to be across the board useful to you, even though consumer goods, of course, are going to be one of the easiest stores of GDP. But it is now a balancing act. You need to control demand, so you want to be in control of export trade routes, but you also want to be able to control the amount of money going to the industries in question. And so import trade routes that help reduce the cost of your input goods for things like tooling workshops can be very powerful. But ultimately, this GDP is going to be calculated based off of truly consumed goods. So you can see here that we have grain. Grain is currently operating with a positive almost 18,000 balance. That means that those 18,000 units of grain that currently exist inside the British market don't actually contribute anything to our GDP, and they actually decrease the GDP. That said, they might be helpful to the standard of living, but they're going to be decreasing our GDP because now grain that would be selling at 20 per unit is going to be selling at 15 per unit, basically. And that means that these pops who are consuming this 43,000, as well as the trade routes and the purchased for slaves, those are going to be calculating into our GDP at a lower price per unit. And of course, the livestock ranches and food industry purchases here, because these are input goods now in a building, they actually don't increase your GDP at all. That said, of course, you're going to be getting GDP knock-ons in good ways if you're building up industries that are consuming mid-tier goods. Not only because, generally speaking, these sorts of buildings are going to have a fairly high earnings potential, but also just because across the board you want to be building things that are going to help you meet unmet buy orders, because that's really the way that you're going to be growing your GDP. If you have an unmet buy order, then you can actually grow your GDP really easily by targeting that good in particular. Of course, it's going to have knock-on effects that the more that you're producing in the market, the more that you're depressing the cost of the good, and therefore maximizing your GDP out of your goods can actually be pretty complicated. But because it's complicated in a way that I don't think actually benefits you to specialize too much, I would say that just focus on making sure that you're building the most productive buildings that you can. That's going to be injecting the most money into your economy, and then focus on trying to capture the most productive trade routes that you can find. If you find a productive trade route with a revolutionary country, you can take it if you want, but be aware that it might disappear pretty quickly. But that, of course, has some knock-on effects to prestige, because prestige, of course, is going to be generated from a lot of different things, but it's going to be generated from your GDP and the GDP of your subjects. And of course, your minting is going to be coming from your GDP as well. So what that means is that, generally speaking, prestige numbers are going to be lower in Victoria 3 and in Open Beta 1.2. But I think that that's a nice opportunity for us to talk about rank and subject behaviors now. So it used to be in 1.0 and 1.1 that you could subjugate somebody who is 1 rank lower than you, but now it's 2 ranks. And this is, I think, a really big diplomatic change, because it means that you can't just go around puppeting Spain as any of the great powers on day one. And you have to be very cognizant about your position and the cap of your position, because keep in mind, it's 2 ranks lower now, right? And so Afghanistan cannot achieve a higher rank than an unrecognized regional power so long as we're a subject of Great Britain. So even though we have the number 8 GDP in the world now, that doesn't matter because we can't grow our rank. Now that said, of course, our GDP is only growing because we're part of the British market. And so this is a really interesting balancing act when it comes to how do you adapt in 1.2. The change in GDP means that if you're going to be doing a heavy industry specialization, then don't be afraid to be heavy industry and export. Because heavy industry and export can be very powerful, and it allows you to make sure that A, cost of your heavy industry goods are kept to a bare minimum, and then B, it also lets you transform those things into GDP if you want to, because you could export them, and thereby turn something that wouldn't normally be a consumed good into a consumed good for your GDP. I think across the board, this highlights something very specific about the game, that growing your economy is not just growing your GDP, it's just moving the most money around. And so I think one of the most important things that you need to keep in mind is your national revenue bottom line. At this point, our national revenue bottom line has been buffed up a lot by some Diplo pacts because we've been bullying some of the great powers into giving us money. But we'll see how long we can keep that going. But it does mean that war reparations are a lot stronger in 1.2 because it's not as easy to just grow your economy to colossal scale, because your minting is going to be a lot smaller simply by virtue of your GDP being a lot smaller. And of course, as one final note, this means that free trade, if you're trying to grow your GDP, is functionally mandatory because you do need volume of goods moving in and out in order to maximize your GDP. That doesn't necessarily mean that maximizing your GDP is the only way to go, but it does mean that if any step that you take away from free trade is going to have knock-on effects to your GDP, down to isolationism, which nowadays I'm not even sure how you're supposed to make this function, because without trade routes, boy, an economy is going to grow really slowly in Victoria 3. I also like the Faustian bargain nature of becoming a subject early game as an unrecognized power, because it's much better, generally speaking, for your growth potential if you can gain recognition before you become a subject. But if you're playing as an unrecognized power like Afghanistan, you're not going to have easy ways to gain recognition before you hop in on the British market. And so it's a really interesting game, I think. Open Beta 1.2 looks really promising. All right. That's Walker. Let me know if you still have any questions about the GDP rework. The easiest way to understand your GDP is just understand it as the met buy orders of your POPs and your trade routes. And once you get that under your belt, it makes a lot of sense. All right, that's Walker. Take care.